Okay, so as you see from the title, so this video is supposed to really be about Hashem. And it's specifically about the way we tend to think about Hashem as having something to do with being infinite. And I really sort of want to try to talk about that a little bit carefully and get a sense of what we might mean when we're saying words like infinite when talking about Hashem. And then also to sort of think about who cares? Like, what's the relevance of that question, even when we think about Hashem as being infinite or not? And so, the first thing to sort of think about with these types of questions and these types of discussions is that these are not philosophical discussions, really, at least not intrinsically. Like, yes, there is a philosophically oriented thought process that sort of you can view it that way, kind of coming with the discussion. But the discussions are not intrinsically just kind of like an exercise in ideas. They're much more about dealing with the whole relationship component of Hashem and us. Because when you want to try to think about Hashem or you want to try to interact with Hashem, so it's going to depend on how you fundamentally perceive Hashem. That will determine the kind of experience or relationship experience, really, that you'll have with Hashem. So, and really, if one of the sad things about the Torah lifestyle that we're, kind of leading nowadays, whether you're leading it, following halacha actively, or you just have like a traditional Jewish background or whatever, everyone is struggling with one core issue, which is that the Torah lifestyle is all about Hashem. Like, it's all about, people call that God sometimes. We're going to talk about that word also a little bit, but like, the whole thing is about Hashem. Like, it revolves around Hashem. Hashem is the centerpiece, and not even just the center. It's like the bulk. Like, most of the lifestyle is about Hashem. But Hashem gets both very little press time. Gets very little. We don't talk about Hashem too much. Maybe we read about Hashem, we mention Hashem, but to actually have like a serious discussion about Hashem. So in my life, like, I have very rarely had such a thing, growing up or being in school and in yeshiva and whatever other settings I was in. It was not a common discussion to even have about, who do we mean? What exactly is this? Like, there's so many questions that it's like even hard to know where to start thinking about this. And when you kind of leave it as an undefined entity, like, well, there's just a guy in the sky that we're supposed to believe in, well, that's almost worse than nothing, because then you have this very childish perspective that essentially defines the kind of, like, if you decide that you're going to believe in that and then live a Torah lifestyle and build it around that and make that the centerpiece, that's Hashem being in the center, the guy in the sky who is watching you and trying to punish you when you do the wrong things and give you special rewards you do the right things. So that's a recipe for intense misunderstandings of the Torah, and also very unhealthy, shallow lifestyle approaches and perspectives. And it also just happens to be false. So that's that's why it's so unhealthy, because false ideas fundamentally cannot, they cannot persist in existing. So these are some of the factors in terms of how to think about this. It's not really just an exercise in philosophy or just random thinking. This is part of Torah. There's a book called Mesilat Yesharim. Really, it's translated, that means the path of the straight, kind of like the straight path in life. And it's really about truth and about proper perspective. And in the introduction to that book, so the author we call him the Ramchal. So that's an acronym for Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. But the whole introduction there is essentially how people tend to take the most important things and leave them on the side in the background, and they focus on the things that are easiest. So since halacha is very easy to do and to talk about, so people tend to teach and talk about halacha a lot, but to have a really serious discussion about the really central, core elements of Torah, that's just not a very common thing, the Ramchal writes. It's a few hundred years ago that he wrote that, and it's just as true today. We're trying to break this barrier. There's different people teaching these things, but this is still a serious problem. And so this discussion is really super important in terms of really getting to a more mature understanding of who we mean when we say Hashem, and like how to even begin approaching this thing, this self, whatever you want to call Hashem, that we really, if we want to, all our lives revolve around Hashem, so like we really want to get to that place in a real way, so you have to sort of take those steps. So, like the title said, not infinite. So that's really the concept we're going to try to unpack a little bit right now. Not infinite. So what do I mean when I say that Hashem is not infinite? So the tricky thing here is that you have to sort of know how to think when you're thinking about Hashem. It's not just like all kinds of thought. There are different styles and patterns of thought in general, and you have to sort of understand your toolkit, like what you come to the table with in terms of your thoughts, in order to understand how to begin to think about this topic. So let's just start to illustrate a little bit. When people talk about Hashem being infinite, so the issue with that is that infinite, just if we wanted to define it, so usually infinite is defined as that which goes on and on and on in space. Things that are finite are things that are, they only occupy a certain amount of space. Things that are infinite are things that are just going on and on and on in space. So you can think as kind of like an analogy. One example of something which is infinite is the number system. So the number system seems to go on and on and on and on forever. So even though that is, those are numbers, they're quantities. Each one is a discrete quantity, seemingly 1 and 2 and 3, and 3 is not 4 and 4 is not 5. Each one of those is like a separate entity, but they seem to just go on and on and on and on, at least conceptually, forever. So that's kind of like what we mean when we say infinity, infinite in that sense. So when you talk about Hashem, so when you want to say that Hashem is infinite, so here's what you're doing that's kind of undermining your own attempt to get to know Hashem. You are using terms that are from within the system to describe something which is not within or not part of the system. You live inside, we call inside of space-time, inside of space and time. You move through time, and you also exist within space, and you operate inside of this area. There's here, there's there. I'm in this room, you're in a different room. We're using the cameras to sort of like create a connection between us, but we are distant in certain ways, and we're now trying to create a bridge through technology to connect in our distance, in our separation through space and time. So, and this is as I'm making this, it's already, as you're watching it now, it already happened. It's in the past, but I'm reaching out from the past through the video now into the future to now be heard through time. So this is like there's a distance of space and time that exists that we're kind of part of, that we're inside of. And so when you talk about Hashem as being infinite, so then you're really describing Hashem as if he is within space and time in some way, and now he just, there's us, we're small, we're limited in space and time, and Hashem is just really, really big. He's like, fills all of space and time. And we have songs like that, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, one of the most popular vague attempts to, in some way, talk about Hashem. And we also, talk about Hashem as being in the sky. Those are kind of like our two most popular go-tos when talking about Hashem. We could also throw in Father and King. Those are also nice, easy go-tos. So when we say that Hashem is infinite, what exactly do we mean by that? So, does that make sense, given that Hashem is Hashem really inside the system in that way? So I want to sort of show you exactly how not useful that term is. So let's just, give an analogy for a second. The analogy is that I want you to imagine that you have a time machine. And what I want you to do with that time machine is I want you to go, and this is a thought experiment, you're going to go inside the time machine, and you're going to journey back in time about 15 billion years, and you're going to get to right as the Big Bang just happened. It's 5 seconds after the Big Bang right now. Okay, you're in the time machine, you went all the way back to 5 seconds after the Big Bang. And yes, for those who are curious, 15 billion years, Big Bang, yes, that is a Jewish perspective. The Ramban wrote about that 1,000 years ago already. And anybody who's curious, and there's also older writings from the Medrash and the Gemara, and there's all kinds of references to these things. So if you're wondering, what do you mean 15 billion years? I thought we said it's only 6 days. That is a Christian perspective. We can have a long discussion about that in a separate video. But for our purposes right now, so you went back, 15 billion years, a little bit less. So you have 5 seconds after the Big Bang happened. And so, you're sitting there, and you're watching the Big Bang start to unfold, and you're looking around. Okay, and then, so now you're right there. You sort of see the primordial, universe as it's beginning to expand from that infinitesimal point into some kind of expansion that leads eventually to what you see around you. Okay, so now what I want you to do is, I want you to set your time machine for another 10 seconds back in time. Now remember, you're 5 seconds after the Big Bang happened. And the Big Bang is not only the beginning of space, it's also the beginning of time. So the timeline kind of starts when the Big Bang begins. And so, 5 seconds into the timeline, into the space line, that's where you are right now. I want you to kind of go back from that time, that 5 seconds after the Big Bang, 10 seconds back. So now you are at -5 seconds. That's where I want you to go with your time machine. And I want you to think about that for a second, a little bit, like what exactly is happening if you try to do that? Is it possible to go back before the Big Bang actually happened? Can you travel to the period that's before time begins? Is that possible to do that? And, when I said that it's minus 5 seconds, that's a way to sort of try to trick your mind a little bit. And you think, well, of course you can go back to before time began because, 5 seconds after time began minus 10 seconds is negative 5 seconds. So there you go. That seems like that's a pretty clear way. That's now negative 5 seconds. That's where you are now. So think about that a little bit. I want you to just, struggle with that. And if you pay attention very carefully, usually I ask this type of question to crowds. When I'm speaking, I'll be like, so what do you see when you go back 5 seconds before the Big Bang? And you have all kinds of answers. People try to describe it. No, well, there's no, it's like, it's just before, it's earlier, it's all dark, there's nothing there yet. These are the usual comments people tend to make, but I wanted to sort of just say it as bluntly as I can. The issue with the question and the attempt to go back in time before time begins is that the concept of before only exists and applies within the framework of time. In other words, only once time begins, which is from the Big Bang, does the concept of before even exist. Before cannot operate outside of a framework of time. It's either within time or there's no such thing as that. And so when you try to go back in time to before time begins, you are now applying terminologies and ideas and mental concepts to a situation in which they are not just like they don't fit so well, they do not exist. There is no such thing as that. It's like you're trying to get a sense of something which is so not in the right place, it just cannot in any way be relevant to that. There is no such concept as before if there is no time existing. And so it's not just that you can't go back before time. There's no such thing as before time. By definition, the concept of before time is a complete non-starter. So it's going to be a little confusing to sort of try to contemplate that. In fact, your mind, when it goes to that point, right when time begins, and you try to kind of press through to what's behind that wall, it's like, well, right behind that wall is like where there's before time. I just want to get through to that. Like as soon as your mind touches that a little bit, it starts to recoil and like shudder a little bit. So that's a little part of something called Ratzov Ashov in Kabbalah. But the point is that it's like, we'll explain that in a separate video, but for those who know that term, that'll be a little useful. But you're just trying to push into like, well, what's before time? And your mind's like, zzz, and it can't really handle that because it just doesn't work. There's no such concept, no such thought. There's no way to ever do that. And so when you're trying to apply the ideas of time to that which is not time, so then you are simply using the wrong set of tools and it's out of context. And I want you to sort of grapple with that and try to feel how off that really is, like how that's so the wrong tool. And it's just, we're talking about it, you could think of them as like, people sometimes say the phrase like different planes of existence. There's the time plane and there's like, well, there's the not time plane. But the idea of saying planes implies there's just different planes. And like, well, here there's, one plane and then somewhere else and somewhen else, there's this other plane, which is still using space language and time language to reference that which is beyond space and time. But I want you to still, just grapple with that and experience that a little bit. And I'm using that to sort of highlight the fact that sometimes if you want to try to think about something which is beyond the system, you have to look in a different direction or use different tools in order to do that. And that's really what, just to sort of bring that back to our discussion here. We talk about Hashem. So Hashem is also, you can't really think about Hashem as a character inside the system, because the Torah's approach to who Hashem is, when you start trying to be like, oh yeah, like, we're in space and Hashem's just really big in space. He's kind of like part of the same thing. There's space and there's lots of space and then he's just really infinite inside of that space. So what you're doing now is you're applying terms that are inside the system to someone or something which is not only just beyond the system, but like really, the source of the system and way beyond that. So just to sort of give you a thought process as an example, there was a guy named Spinoza a while back who came up with this idea called pantheism, where he was like, well, maybe the whole universe is just God. Some people think God is a guy in the sky. Some people think that God is over there. Some people think that God is the sun. Throughout history, there are all these different ideas about who God is. And Spinoza was like, well, maybe God is actually just the entire universe. And that was the biggest, God he could conceive of. It's also what we call the biggest avodah zarah, the biggest, attempt to localize Hashem in some way and be like, okay, well, Hashem is kind of like, he's a thing. In some way, he is, he has some kind of body. So that's, attempting to localize Hashem. That's really the problem with any kind of what's called avodah zarah, is that whenever you do that, whenever you try to have some kind of idol, like an idol worship type of process, you're basically trying to say that Hashem is in some way limited. He's only in this place, only in this space. And so different people said that in different ways. Some people said that God was the sun, and they're like, yeah, that's God, and then whatever is not the sun is not God, and then you're like limiting Hashem to that space and that thing. And so every case of idol worship works that way, and it's interesting just to think why people would do that. But if you say that Hashem is infinite in space, you are essentially doing the same thing. In a certain way, you are now doing what Spinoza did, where you're saying, well, the whole universe is God. So whatever is not universe, could there be such a thing as that? I don't know. But like, what the universe is God, and then you just worship the universe. It's like the biggest the biggest localization attempt of God ever, pretty much. So, and what we claim, what we're saying, is that Hashem is the source of the universe, and Hashem is beyond the universe, and He is beyond space and time. He is what's called spaceless and timeless. He's just not space and time, bound. He just doesn't work that way. So we tend to think about that like not so clearly, but I just want to sort of show what that really looks like if you are timeless and spaceless. So if you're Hashem and you are actually timeless, you're beyond the system. You are, you're out, you can think of it as, again, we're going to use the word outside the system, even though it's a silly word because, the system itself is where the concept of outside exists. Outside means there's inside and there's outside. In space, there's different areas. There's the inner areas, there's outer areas. And so outside applies to, outside of this building is the outside. But when you're talking about space, once space ends, you're talking about there's now, the universe is limited, and so then there's no outside of the universe in that sense. There's no physical idea of inside and outside that applies to beyond the universe. But if you think about it in terms of what if there was some other kind of direction that was not space and time oriented, but in some way Hashem actually was beyond the universe in that way. He's not outside the universe. He is beyond the universe. He is in some way beyond space and beyond time, which again, that's our claim, because even though we live in space and time, and we've been doing that for 15 billion years in some form or another, well, the only thing is that from Hashem's perspective, that's if He's timeless, so that's not a thing. Time is a construct, and space is also a construct. These are things that Hashem made, that He created, that He designed, and now He's using them for the purpose of whatever this whole thing is about, which is a longer discussion too. So, when you start thinking about that a little carefully, so you start to really get a sense of what we really mean when we talk about Hashem as being whatever He is. And I want to just throw a new word at you. One of the names of the Kabbalah, probably the most descriptive name that we have for Hashem, is the phrase Aint So. Hashem is called the Aint So. Aint So means without end. It means there is no end of Hashem in any way. No matter, at every angle, every possible way, there is no end. And that's a very strong description in a certain sense, because it really tells you that there is no limits of any kind, literally none of any kind at all. And so you can start asking all kinds of questions. Well, what about this? What about that? Can Hashem grow? Can Hashem think? Can Hashem then be well, if you say the answer is no, well, that seems to be a limit on Hashem. How do you deal with those things? Exactly what do we mean now when we say that Hashem is Aint So? But the first thing that we need to just know from this video and from this discussion is that Aint So, the endless. When we say that Hashem is totally endless, so He's the endless one, the Aint So. So that is a much stronger and clearer description of Hashem than saying that Hashem is infinite. When you say that Hashem is Aint So that means that Hashem is beyond limitations of space and time. And if you think about that a little carefully, so if you want to think about Hashem as being timeless, so you can think okay, well, so if Hashem is outside or beyond time, so then that means that all of time kind of just happened, or even the word happened is silly, but is all existent simultaneously. You are within time, so you travel through time piece by piece. You watch time unfold, and you basically move through that process of change. But from Hashem's perspective, He is beyond time, so then that means that all of time just is, was, and will be all at once. And what was is actually what is. It's all one giant is, all at once. And so if that's Hashem's interaction or relationship with time, that's what it means to be timeless. So then that kind of implies that if Hashem wants to, He can involve Himself maybe He has, and we're going to talk about how the Torah describes that Hashem has the ability to interact with time in all kinds of ways. So that means that if Hashem wants to interact with 1984 or 1967 or 2002 or whatever, so He can do that at His leisure. Because from Hashem's perspective, these things are all just there, and anytime He wants to sort of insert Himself into different situations, He can do that. And it's not like that, that already passed, so you're going to miss it. Hashem can't miss it because it's all timeless, all at once. That's what we mean when we say that Hashem is the endless one, at least one of the elements of that, which is coming here as a contrast to the idea of infinite, and also as a contrast to the idea of eternal, because infinite means going on and on and on in space, and eternal means going on and on and on in time. So we're talking about Hashem not going on and on and on in time or in space. Hashem is the source of time and space, and therefore he is beyond those things. He has ways of interacting within time and space, but he is beyond them. He is something which is completely different from that, and we think, our minds usually just think within terms of time and space. So to even begin to reach out towards Hashem, you have to understand where to do that. In other words, if you want to look for Hashem, you can't look in the sky. You can't look into the future, into the past. You have to there's no directions where you can really look where Hashem is, because the idea of directions are all within this little box that we live in that we call the universe. So the idea of where and when and what just does not work with Hashem. So how do you reach towards Hashem when that's happening? When that's the way that it's all kind of set up. So I'm just going to give one short beginning to that answer. And again, the point here was really just to highlight the distinction between infinite and endless. But one way of the beginning of that is, for those who watched the video that I put out a week or so ago about the neshama and consciousness. So just like Hashem is not in a where or in a when, the word where is Hashem, which direction do I have to travel to get there? So just like Hashem is not in a where, so too, you, the self that is shining through the body, what we call the neshama, is also not in a where. You are not inside of your body somewhere. If you open up someone's body, you don't find the self. It is something which is completely beyond measure. Consciousness, what we call the neshama, is beyond physical, empirical data points. It is an intangible reality that is not in a place. It definitely manifests through a body, and the body is in a place. So if you want to access me, so you got to kind of either go where this body is, or encounter this body through imagery on videos, like what you're doing right now. That's really what's interesting about videos, is it kind of sets up the situation where you can access me, the self, even if you're not actually where my body is. But the point is that you are not your body, and you are this endless, intangible self that is also not in a where or in a when. It's just that it's linked to a body that right now is in a particular where and in a particular when. So just like that's true about the self, it's also true about Hashem. So that's why, if you want to get to know Hashem, the way to start sensing or sensing Hashem's self, or Hashem's being, or Hashem's presence, whatever word you want to use for that, is you have to learn to sense your own self and the self within others. That's the meaning of the concept of yira, that you should try to be able to sense and see and become aware of the presence of another self. That is the key to sharpening and heightening your ability to detect that which is actually beyond where and when. And it's a whole set of tools to do that. It's not something which just happens in 2 seconds. But one thing is for sure, if you continuously believe that Hashem is a guy in the sky, or over there, or infinite inside of space and time, then you won't ever do the inner traveling within yourself to try to access the sense or the encounter with the intangible you that you actually are, which is actually then the pathway towards the intangible self that we call Hashem. So you can talk all kinds of external things, you can live a halachic lifestyle, you can do all kinds of Torah lifestyle things, and still never journey inside yourself to engage in the process of actual developing self-awareness. That's the whole point of the entire Torah life, is to do this process, but instead we kind of do it in a fragmented way. So that's really also what it means, last week's parsha, when the Torah says, Lo nifleis hi mimcha v'lo rechokahi. It says that this is not something which is separate from you, it's not distant from you. Lo this whole getting close to Hashem, this whole living the Torah life, Lo b'shamayim hi. It's not something somewhere in the heavens, and Lo me'ever layam hi. It's not across the ocean. There's no somewhere in space I could just get to a solution and find the answers that I want. It's just with you. It's always with you. Hashem is always within you. Ki karov elecha davar ma'od. It's something which is right near you. It's literally it's staring you in the face right now. All you have to do is learn, is kind of realize what it is that you're trying to do, and then learn how to use the tools that you're maybe already using, the Torah tools, to access that awareness. And then you start to find Hashem. And then instead of Hashem being some kind of idea that you have, this is a everyday experience of encountering Hashem in your real life all the time. And not some imaginary thing. Hashem, like the Hashem that we've been looking for and dreaming of and waiting for, and saying that it's going to, the world is going to be transformed when we can finally recreate our connection with Hashem the way that it used to be. So this is not a small thing. This is a pretty big deal to be able to do this in any form. And so this is, again, just a beginning and introduction to how to start thinking about this. Who is Hashem? Not infinite, not infinity, not eternal, none of those things. But Hashem is the endless one, the Aint So, and that I think is really the doorway to the next part of the process of developing this. Hope that was clear and that you enjoyed that. Looking forward to seeing some comments, and see you in the next video.